Galbrena was just shown off during the version 2.7 livestream for Wuthering Waves, and you're probably wondering if she's worth it for your account or not. That's what I'm going to be discussing in today's video by talking about Galbrena's biggest pros and cons. With any DPS, the biggest thing to mention is and always will be their damage output. The damage output of a main DPS is most of the time what is going to determine their long-term meta relevance, because the entire job of a DPS is, well, to do damage. So how does Galbrena fare in this department? Well, considering that she is going to be a new character, I think it is suffice to say that she is most likely going to be succeeding in this scenario. We've really seen a trend of the new DPSs being incredibly powerful as of late. Karthia still has the highest damage output in the entire game, Augusta has incredible performance in both game modes, and Frolova absolutely dominates Whimpering Wastes like no one else could. So it really is no stretch of the imagination to say that Galbrena is going to be an incredibly powerful character on the damage spectrum, especially with how she seems to be framed as a pure-on hypercarry character. Where Karthia gets a ton of damage from arrow erosion, and Augusta gets a lot of damage from Yuno, Galbrena definitely seems to be way more on the personal damage side of things. I absolutely would not be surprised if Galbrena's personal damage output ends up being in the top 3 of the entire game, at least in her best in slot team. Because there are some other teams she's most likely going to be able to play in, where the focus is less so on her personal damage and rather on the entire team. But that's going to be a topic for later in the video. The next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that Galbrena is a pistol character. And while this alone doesn't say much, when you look at her animations, you can see that Galbrena is capable of playing from a range pretty well. Playing from a range is one of the biggest advantages to another pistol character, being Carlotta. If you're able to play from a range, you're able to see what enemies are doing without actually having to engage in their mechanics. While a melee character like Augusta or Gien might have to look at what the enemy is doing and dodge accordingly, a ranged character has way more leeway in this regard, because not only are you able to just not get hit by a lot of enemy attacks, when the enemy does start rushing for you, you have a bit of a head start on running away from them. And even if you decide not to run away from them, you have more time to react to any potential attacks. Meaning that playing from a range is simply going to be a way more comfortable playstyle than playing close up. And not just that, a character that plays from a range doesn't really have to care about whether the enemy is in the air or not. You're able to just shoot them down either way. This is something that, for example, Gien struggles with a ton. When the enemy is in the air, he can't really do much about it. And because he's a duration-based character, this ends up impacting his damage output and energy regeneration a ton. But Galbrena and Carlotta, being ranged characters, are most likely just not gonna care about this. They're just gonna beat the enemy either way. The next thing I wanted to talk about is that Galbrena's gameplay looks incredibly dynamic. She seems to have both enhanced heavy attacks as well as enhanced normal attacks. And while it's currently unclear which one is technically going to be better for damage output, one thing is certain if you ask me, which is the fact that Galbrena seems to not really care about if she has to dodge or not. Let me elaborate. Some characters have incredibly set-in-stone rotations that you can't really change much, because if you decide to change their rotation, you end up losing a ton of damage output, or sometimes the character will just stop working. But there are other characters who are able to just kind of freestyle and see what they want to do. For example, think of Carlotta as one of those characters that has an incredibly set-in-stone rotation. You really cannot deviate much from a Carlotta rotation, because the second you start deviating, you start running into problems. But I don't see Galbrena being that kind of character. Sure, there will be an optimal way to play her, but there's most likely not going to be a end-all be-all rotation that if you end up deviating from it, you lose a ton of performance. I really cannot see that being the case. She's really dynamic. She even has a unique aerial attack that is reminiscent of Dante's Rainstorm in Devil May Cry. Yeah, I had to reference Devil May Cry at least once in this video. You know me better than this by now. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. This means that when something goes wrong within your Galbrena rotation, you're able to very easily recover from that. My next point is that I see Galbrena having a ton of potential teammates. Because, well, The archetype she is a part of simply has a lot of options to choose from. Not only is she a fusion character and thus has access to Lupa, she's also an echo skill character, which means she has access to the entirety of Frolova's gang. So Galbrena is going to end up having a ton of team options. Sure, she'll have her best in slot team, most likely composed of Choyuan and Shorekeeper. But if you don't want to get Choyuan, but you have some other characters lying around, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to make a good core for Galbrena. How about Frolova Shorekeeper? Or Frolova Cantarella? They're both gonna be good. Oh, what if you wanted to be fancy with it and ran Brand Lupa? That's good. You can run Mortefi Lupa and that's good. You have a ton of options for your teammates, and you're not necessarily locked into one specific team like some other characters. Zani. However, this is where the monkey paw finger curls a bit, because as you may have noticed, I talked about a lot of 5-star characters there, and there wasn't really a 4-star except for Mortefi, but he also really wanted Lupa. Because now it's time to get into the negatives of Galbrena. And since I already have such a good segue, let's just talk about this point first. A lot of Galbrena's teammates are 5-star characters. And that is because Galbrena's kit is centered around a niche that has become popular relatively recently, and thus doesn't really have any good 4-star characters within it. There is no 4-star support for fusion characters, which means that that avenue is already gone. Galbrena deals primarily echo skill damage and also has good heavy attack damage, which means that while Mortefi would be a good fit within the Galbrena team logically, a lot of her damage just won't be benefiting from Mortefi's outro skill, and thus Mortefi ends up being a good option but not an insane option. So 4-star options just aren't really there for her. Echo damage doesn't have a 4-star buffer yet, and honestly I don't think we're gonna get one. And that leaves us with primarily 5-star characters, which, you know, if you have been playing for a while now, there is a pretty good chance you have a bunch of 5-stars by this point. Considering the amount of love Fusion has been getting, there might even be a pretty good chance you have one of the Fusion characters to pair her up with. But if you don't, you're most likely gonna have to end up pulling for Choyuan on the second half. Now I would like to reiterate that in a vacuum, Mortefi Shorekeeper is going to clear the endgame content fine. You're not gonna have many issues with this team. But it is just a big downgrade from the premium Galbrena teams, and that is what you have to consider here. Not the fact that Galbrena is worthless without a 5-star character, but rather the sheer loss you're going to see in her damage output. And now it's time for my final point, which is that Galbrena, being a pistol character, doesn't seem to have very promising AoE situations. I'm primarily basing this off of her weapon type, as well as the other example we have of pistol DPS characters, being Chishia and Carlotta. Both of these characters don't exactly have the greatest AoE in the game, and they are primarily single target focused characters. Carlotta is able to work around this with positioning, and I don't doubt that Galbrena will be a very similar situation, but I still don't think her AoE is going to be all that good. From what we saw in the livestream, it looks decent, but not crazy. It's just kinda, you can hit a couple enemies if they're grouped up, but the second they ungroup, you're only going to be hitting one of them. It's very similar to Carlotta. Carlotta's damage is in a straight line, which means that if enemies are close together, Carlotta will be able to position herself correctly in order to hit a ton of them, at least with her ultimate. Galbrena seems to be in a pretty similar situation. You really want the enemies to be grouped up, and if they're not, good luck hitting them. But that's just my opinion on Galbrena. Let me know what you think of her in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, the best place to reach me would be through my Discord server, which is linked in the description below. If you just want to see more of me, you can also check the description below to check out my second channel. I don't really post that frequently, but I can just make videos about whatever I feel like. But that'll be all from me. Peace.